It was a quiet Friday evening, November 3rd, 7:42 p.m., in the small town of Riverton. The fading autumn sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of a gas station on Route 89. Suddenly, the sound of roaring engines shattered the calm. Three leather-clad bikers rolled into the lot, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel as they dismounted. "Hey, kid," the leader barked, his voice as rough as his beard. His name was Greg, mid-40s, with a patchy vest that told stories of old bar fights and bad decisions. The bikers swaggered towards 16-year-old James Carter, who had been calmly filling up his bike, a modest second-hand Kawasaki. James, a wiry teen with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, glanced up from the nozzle. The men loomed over him, sneering. "Nice bike, boy," another said, a toothpick bouncing between his lips. "How'd someone like you afford it? You steal it?" It was the same tone James had heard too many times before. The kind laced with an unspoken message. "You don't belong here." But James didn't flinch, not even when Greg stepped closer, poking a meaty finger into his chest. "What are you going to do if we take it? Huh? Cry for your mommy?" Greg and his crew never saw it coming. In one fluid motion, James grabbed Greg's arm, twisted it into a lock, and swept his legs out from under him. Greg hit the ground hard, the air whooshing out of his lungs. The other bikers froze in stunned silence. "I didn't want trouble," James said calmly, "but you made it your problem." The title of this shocking tale? Bikers threaten a teen, unaware he's trained to fight back. They instantly regret it, and let me tell you, the regret? Oh, it was just getting started. James' move wasn't a fluke. He had trained in martial arts for years, learning from his father, a retired Army instructor. And as the bikers regrouped, seething with humiliation, they had no idea they were about to make their second mistake of the night. James had always been a quiet kid, a bit of a loner. After school, while others played video games or hung out at the mall, he spent hours at the local dojo perfecting his moves. Riverton wasn't exactly a diverse town, and as one of the only biracial kids in his school, James often felt like he had to prove himself twice as hard. His mom always told him, "Kindness first, James. But if they push you, never let them break you." That Friday, he had planned a peaceful ride out of town, heading to his favorite spot by the lake to watch the sunset. With his helmet tucked under his arm, he stopped at the gas station to fuel up, humming along to a tune in his head. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening. The bikers showed up out of nowhere. Their loud engines and mocking laughter drew attention, but James tried to ignore them. He figured they were just passing through. Then he caught their stares, whispered comments, the kind that made his skin prickle. "Hey, check it out," one of them snickered. "Little boy thinks he's a biker." James stayed calm, focusing on the pump. He learned to tune out nonsense like this, until Greg and his crew blocked his way. That's when things escalated. They circled him like vultures, throwing insults about his bike, his size, and things he'd rather not repeat. "Just leave me alone," James said evenly, trying to defuse the situation. But Greg wasn't having it. "Oh, we'll leave you alone," Greg said with a smirk, cracking his knuckles. "Right after you hand over those keys." The moment Greg reached for the bike, James' instincts kicked in. Years of discipline and training guided his every move. He wasn't scared. He was prepared. Greg's buddies snapped out of their shock, charging at James. One swung a chain, but James sidestepped effortlessly, countering with a precise kick to the man's knee. The third biker lunged, only to find himself flipped onto his back. By the time it was over, all three men were sprawled on the ground, groaning. James stood over them, barely breaking a sweat. "You shouldn't judge someone by their size," he said, dusting off his jacket, "or by their skin." But as James turned to leave, the unmistakable sound of an engine revving filled the air. James spun around just in time to see Greg, still clutching his ribs, climbing onto his massive Harley, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" Greg snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with, kid." The roar of the bike echoed ominously as Greg sped off, leaving James standing in the fading light. A cold sense of foreboding settled in his chest. He didn't know where Greg was going, or who he was calling, but he knew this wasn't the end. The roar of Greg's bike faded into the distance, leaving James alone at the gas station. His heartbeat had slowed to a steady rhythm, but something about Greg's parting words didn't sit right. James tightened the strap on his helmet and swung his leg over his Kawasaki. The wind was getting colder, and the idea of reaching the quiet lake sounded better than ever. But as he rode down Route 89, the uneasiness stayed with him. He had handled himself back there, his training had paid off, but Greg didn't seem like the kind of guy to let things go, especially not after being humiliated in front of his buddies. As the town lights disappeared in his rearview mirror, James tried to focus on the road ahead. The trees lining the highway stood tall and silent, their bare branches like skeletons reaching toward the darkening sky. It was peaceful, but in a way that made him feel exposed. Meanwhile, Greg had pulled into a dingy bar on the outskirts of Riverton, where the only thing colder than the beer was the reception for outsiders. The faded neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly as Greg stomped inside, slamming the door behind him. "Yo, Greg," called a man at the counter, raising his glass. "What's with the face? You lose another bet?" Greg ignored the laughter, his jaw tight. He headed straight for a corner table where a group of burly men sat playing cards. These weren't ordinary bikers. They were members of an outlaw club known as the Black Vultures. And they didn't play nice. "Boys," Greg growled, leaning in close. "I've got a situation." The largest of the group, a man called Tank, snorted. "What kind of situation, Greg? You lose a fight with a raccoon?" "No, I lost to some punk kid." Greg slammed his fist on the table, the sound cutting through the bar noise. "He embarrassed me in front of my crew. Took us all down like it was nothing." The table went quiet. The Black Vultures weren't used to hearing about anyone taking Greg down, let alone a teenager. Tank leaned back in his chair, his interest piqued. "What are you saying, Greg? You need us to handle your little problem?" Greg nodded, a sinister grin spreading across his face. "Not just handle. I want him taught a lesson he won't forget." Unaware of the storm brewing back in town, James pulled up to the lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight, its surface calm and undisturbed. He parked his bike by the edge and sat down on a rock, letting the cool breeze clear his mind. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. No noise, no tension, just the quiet hum of nature. James thought about his dad's words, spoken to him during countless training sessions. Control your breath, control the fight. It wasn't just about physical combat. It was about keeping your mind steady, even when everything else felt out of control. But tonight, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. His instincts, honed over years of sparring and drills, told him to stay alert. He had learned to trust those instincts. As he stood to leave, the faint sound of engines in the distance caught his ear. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a low growl carried by the wind. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder. Closer. James turned toward the highway, his pulse quickening. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One bike, two bikes, three, no, four. The sound of roaring engines filled the air as a group of bikers turned onto the dirt road leading to the lake. James didn't wait. He jumped on his bike and revved the engine, but before he could take off, one of the bikers cut him off, skidding to a stop in front of him. Another pulled up behind, blocking any escape. Tank dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. He was a mountain of a man, his leather vest straining against his chest. "So, you're the kid who gave Greg a hard time, huh?" he rumbled, his voice like a distant thunderstorm. James glanced around, his mind racing. He could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up, waiting to pounce. But he didn't let the fear show. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said calmly, though his grip on the handlebars tightened. "Oh, I think you do," Tank replied, cracking his knuckles. "Greg's got a special request. Says you need a reminder of where you stand." The bikers laughed, their voices echoing across the empty lake. James' heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had faced odds before. He could do it again. Tank stepped closer, towering over James. "Now here's how this is going to go, kid. You're going to get off that bike, apologize to Greg, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you walk out of here." James didn't move. Instead, he straightened up, his eyes meeting Tank's without a hint of fear. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice steady. "Trust me." Tank smirked. "Oh, I think I do." Before James could respond, Tank lunged, grabbing for him. James reacted instantly, his training kicking in. He swerved out of the way, kicking the bike into gear just as the other bikers closed in. The sound of engines roared through the night as James found himself in a deadly game of cat and mouse, the black vultures hot on his heels. The dirt road shook beneath James' tires as he gunned his Kawasaki, weaving through the trees like a thread through a needle. The headlights of the black vultures bore down on him, their roaring engines filling the night like a pack of wolves in full hunt mode. Dust kicked up in his wake, but James knew it wouldn't slow them down. Tank was right on his tail, yelling over the deafening noise, "You can't run forever, kid." But James wasn't running. Not really. His eyes darted between the narrow path ahead and his side mirrors, where the bikers were closing in. His mind raced just as fast as his engine. Stay calm. Think 2 steps ahead. His dad's voice echoed in his head. Up ahead, the dirt road split into 2. Without hesitation, James took the left path, leaning hard into the turn. Tank and one of the bikers followed, but the other 2 skidded, their tires slipping in the loose gravel as they veered right. 2 down, 2 to go, James thought, though he knew this wasn't over. James remembered this trail well. It led to the old bridge that spanned a rocky creek. It was a rickety thing, barely wide enough for a car. But James had crossed it dozens of times. He knew the creaky planks and wobbly railings like the back of his hand. The bikers? They wouldn't know what hit them. The bridge came into view, its wooden beams illuminated by his headlight. James twisted the throttle, pushing his bike faster. As he hit the first plank, the entire structure groaned under the weight of the bike. He sped across, the wind whipping at his face, and didn't slow down until he reached the other side. Tank and his companion weren't far behind. Tank roared onto the bridge, his massive bike making the planks shudder. But his buddy wasn't as lucky. One of the boards snapped beneath him, and his front tire jammed into the gap. He flew over the handlebars, landing with a thud in the creek below. James glanced over his shoulder. Only Tank remained now. But instead of relief, James felt the tension build. Tank wasn't like the others. He was calculated. Dangerous. Tank made it across the bridge, his bike roaring as he closed the gap between them. The dirt path gave way to open fields, the moonlight casting long shadows across the tall grass. James could see the edge of the woods ahead, a dense forest where the paths were tight and winding. It was his best chance to lose Tank, but the big man wasn't letting up. "Nowhere to run now, kid," Tank bellowed as he drew closer. James shifted his weight, preparing for another sharp turn. He darted into the woods, his bike bouncing over roots and rocks as he maneuvered through the dense foliage. The trees whipped past him in a blur, their trunks barely missing his handlebars. Tank's heavy bike struggled to keep pace, the low-hanging branches smacking against him as he tore through the forest. But James knew these woods. Every twist and turn was imprinted in his memory from years of exploring on his bike. He zigzagged through the narrow trails, Tank's growls of frustration growing fainter with each passing second. Finally, James burst out of the woods and onto an open road. For the first time in minutes, he exhaled. He had bought himself some breathing room. But as James slowed to a stop at the edge of a clearing, he realized he wasn't alone. Standing in the middle of the road, silhouetted against the moonlight, was Greg. He was grinning, his hands resting on his hips. Behind him were the 2 bikers who had taken the wrong turn earlier. Their bikes were parked haphazardly on the road, blocking any escape. "Thought you could get away, didn't you?" Greg said, his voice dripping with malice. James' heart sank. He had been so focused on losing Tank, he hadn't considered the possibility of a trap. He tightened his grip on the handlebars, his mind racing again. He could see Tank's headlight emerging from the woods behind him. He was completely surrounded. Greg took a step forward, his grin widening. "You've got nowhere to run now, kid. And this time, you're not getting off so easy." James revved his engine, his eyes darting between the bikers blocking the road and Tank closing in behind him. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had to make a move. But which one? James was trapped, Tank's rumbling engine closing in from behind, Greg and his goons standing in the road ahead. The odds weren't just against him. They were practically laughing in his face. "Give it up, kid," Greg sneered, cracking his knuckles. "It's time you learn what happens when you mess with the wrong crowd." James didn't answer. He couldn't waste energy on words. His mind was working overtime, analyzing the situation. His dad's voice echoed in his head. "Every fight has a weakness. Find it." The road ahead wasn't just blocked by Greg and the bikers. It was framed by tall shrubs on both sides. Behind him, Tank's headlight grew brighter, the roar of his engine like a drumbeat in James' chest. Then James noticed something. To his right, the shrubs thinned, revealing a narrow path that veered off the road. It wasn't much, barely wide enough for his bike. But it was something. Greg took a step forward, gesturing for the others to follow. "Come on, boys. Let's teach this punk some manners." Tank skidded to a stop behind James, grinning as he dismounted his bike. "Nowhere left to go, kid. You should have just handed over the bike." The bikers closed in, their boots crunching on the gravel. James took a deep breath. He couldn't overpower them all, but he didn't need to. All he needed was an opening. Suddenly, James revved his engine, the noise cutting through the tension like a thunderclap. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Greg. For a brief moment, it looked like he was going to charge straight at him. "Is he serious?" one of the bikers muttered, taking a step back. Greg laughed, his confidence unshaken. "Go ahead, tough guy. Let's see what you've got." But just as Greg braced himself, James yanked the handlebars hard to the right, veering off the road and onto the narrow path. The bike bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, but James held steady, his body moving in sync with the machine. After him, Greg roared, shoving one of his men toward their bikes. Tank was the first to react, jumping back onto his Harley and tearing after James. Greg and the others followed, their engines roaring to life. The narrow path was a challenge for the bulky bikes, but they didn't care. The chase was back on. James ducked low, his bike skimming under low-hanging branches. The path twisted and turned, but his smaller Kawasaki handled the tight spaces with ease. Behind him, the sound of Tank's Harley crashing through the undergrowth was getting louder. Up ahead, the path opened into a clearing surrounded by steep hills. James pushed his bike harder, the tires skidding slightly as he tried to climb the incline. The Kawasaki wasn't built for off-road, but he had no choice. The bikers were right behind him. As James reached the top of the hill, he spotted something that made his heart skip. In the distance, near the edge of the clearing, a lone pickup truck was parked. Its headlights were off, but James could see someone standing beside it. James squinted, his mind racing. Was it a passerby? Another biker? "Help me out here," he muttered under his breath, steering toward the truck. Behind him, Tank and the others emerged from the path, their bikes roaring as they tore into the clearing. Greg was laughing, his voice carrying over the noise. "You're just making it worse, kid. There's no way out." James ignored him, focusing on the truck. As he got closer, he realized the person standing there was an older man, leaning against the hood with a calm expression. He was tall and wiry, his face weathered by years of hard work. The man looked up as James approached, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The frantic teen on the bike, the gang of bikers chasing him. "Trouble, huh?" the man said, his voice steady. He didn't wait for James to answer. Instead, he stepped forward and reached into the bed of the truck, pulling out a long crowbar. The bikers were closing in fast, but the man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, the crowbar resting lightly in his hands. James skidded to a stop beside the truck, his chest heaving. "These guys," he started, but the man raised a hand, cutting him off. "I can see what's happening," he said calmly. "Stay put." Tank was the first to reach the truck, his Harley grinding to a stop a few feet away. He dismounted, glaring at the man. "Out of the way, old man. This isn't your fight." The man tilted his head, his grip on the crowbar tightening. "Funny," he said. "Looks to me like it's about to be." Greg and the others pulled up behind Tank, their bikes forming a semicircle around the truck. James could feel the tension rising. The man didn't look scared, but he was outnumbered. "Last warning," Greg said, stepping forward. "Move. Now." The man smiled faintly. "You boys really should have stayed home tonight." Before Greg could respond, the man swung the crowbar in a blur of motion. slamming it against Tank's bike with a deafening crash. Sparks flew as the metal dented, the sound echoing across the clearing. Tank roared in rage, lunging toward the man. But James saw the glint in the older man's eyes, a calm, steely determination that promised things were about to get very interesting. The sound of Tank's roar mixed with the echo of the crowbar, smashing against metal. The other bikers hesitated, their eyes darting between Tank and the older man who had just turned a quiet clearing into a battlefield. The stranger, still calm, twirled the crowbar in his hands like it was an extension of his body. Tank charged, his fists clenched and his bulk bearing down on the older man like a freight train. But the man didn't move. He waited, his stance relaxed, until Tank was almost on him. Then he stepped aside. In one fluid motion, the man swung the crowbar low, hooking it behind Tank's leg. The big biker tripped, his momentum carrying him forward, and he crashed into the dirt with a ground-shaking thud. The air went out of him in a loud wheeze. "You picked the wrong kid to mess with," the man said coolly, standing over Tank. Greg, who had been watching from the sidelines, clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to losing control, and the sight of Tank sprawled in the dirt made his blood boil. "Get him!" Greg barked, motioning to the other bikers. The remaining two thugs hesitated for only a second before rushing at the man, their boots pounding the ground. James watched from the safety of his bike, his heart pounding as the scene unfolded. The older man didn't flinch. As the first biker lunged at him, he sidestepped and swung the crowbar upward, catching the man's ribs with a sickening crack. The biker crumpled, gasping for air. The second thug tried a different tactic, circling around to attack from behind. But before he could land a punch, the older man spun, jabbing the crowbar into his gut. The biker doubled over, groaning as he stumbled backward. James couldn't believe what he was seeing. This stranger wasn't just skilled. He was surgical, every move calculated and efficient. James had seen his dad take down opponents before, but this was on another level. Who are you?" James asked, his voice tinged with awe. The man glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "Name's Cole," he said, "and you look like someone who could use a hand." James nodded, still trying to process everything. "Thanks," he said. "But why are you helping me?" Cole shrugged, wiping the crowbar on his jeans. "Let's just say I've got a soft spot for underdogs. And I don't like bullies." Greg was now the last man standing. His crew lay scattered around the clearing, groaning and clutching their injuries. But instead of fear, Greg's face was twisted in fury. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. "You think you've won?" Greg snarled, pointing the knife at Cole. "You've got no idea who you're messing with. I'll get you right here." Cole raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the threat. "You can try," he said, his voice steady. "But you're going to wish you hadn't." Greg lunged, slashing the knife in a wide arc. But Cole was already moving. He sidestepped the attack, bringing the crowbar down hard on Greg's wrist. The knife flew out of Greg's hand, landing with a metallic clink in the dirt. Greg howled in pain, clutching his wrist as he stumbled back. Cole didn't let up. He advanced on Greg, his presence commanding. "Here's the thing about bullies like you," Cole said, his voice low and firm. "You only win when no one fights back." Greg fell to his knees, his bravado crumbling. "Wait," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Stop. I give up." Cole stopped, standing over him with the crowbar resting on his shoulder. He glanced at James. "What do you think, kid? You want to finish this?" James hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Part of him wanted to see Greg pay for what he'd done, for the insults, the threats, the fear he had tried to instill. But another part of him remembered his mom's words. "Kindness first, James. Always." "No," James said finally, stepping forward. "It's over. Let him go." Greg looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're letting me go?" "Yeah," James said, his voice firm. "But if you ever come after me, or anyone else, again, you won't be so lucky." Cole nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough," he said, stepping back. Greg scrambled to his feet, his face pale. "You'll regret this," he muttered, backing away. "You'll leave," Cole interrupted, his tone sharp. "Now." Greg didn't argue. He turned and stumbled toward his bike, clutching his wrist. The sound of his engine sputtering to life filled the clearing as he sped off, leaving his crew behind. As the dust settled, James looked at Cole, a dozen questions swirling in his mind. "How do you know all that?" he asked. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Cole's smile faded slightly, his eyes distant. "Let's just say I've been in a few scraps," he said. "But you've got skills too, kid. Someone's trained you well." James nodded. "My dad." Cole's gaze sharpened. "Your dad, huh? What's his name?" Before James could answer, the faint sound of sirens reached their ears, growing louder by the second. Someone had called the cops. The sound of sirens grew louder, their wailing slicing through the still night air. James turned toward the source, his mind racing. Who called the cops? It didn't matter. He glanced at Cole, but the man was already moving, tossing the crowbar into the truck's bed with practiced ease. "You don't look like someone who sticks around for questions," James said, half joking. Cole smirked, climbing into the truck's cab. "Smart kid. You be right." He paused, giving James a long look. "But you've got questions of your own, don't you?" James hesitated. "Yeah, like who you are, and how you fight like that." The sirens were closer now. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance. Cole sighed, tapping the steering wheel. "You really want answers, kid? Meet me tomorrow at Ironwood Diner, 10 a.m. He shifted into gear, the truck rumbling to life. "And bring your bike. You're gonna need it." "Wait," James started, but Cole didn't give him a chance. The truck roared away, kicking up gravel as it disappeared into the darkness. James was left standing in the clearing, the adrenaline from the night's events still coursing through his veins. The cops arrived moments later, 2 patrol cars screeching to a stop near the unconscious bikers. "Hands up!" one of the officers shouted as they exited their vehicles. Flashlights pointed in James' direction. James immediately complied, raising his hands. "I'm not armed," he called out. "These guys," he gestured to the groaning bikers on the ground. "They attacked me." The officers exchanged glances before one of them approached, keeping his flashlight steady on James. "Start talking," he said, his tone firm but not unfriendly. James took a deep breath and began explaining everything. The confrontation at the gas station, the chase, and how Cole had stepped in to help. As he spoke, the officers checked on the bikers, cuffing them one by one and calling for an ambulance for the guy who had gone down at the bridge. "So, this Cole guy," the officer said when James finished. "Where is he now?" "He left," James admitted, wincing at how suspicious it sounded. "But he saved me. If he hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened." The officer studied James for a moment, then nodded. "All right, son. Let's get the full story at the station." After giving a statement, James was finally allowed to leave. By the time he got home, the clock read 3:17 a.m. He parked his bike in the garage and crept inside, careful not to wake his mom. But as he reached the stairs, the living room light flicked on. "James?" his mom called, her voice thick with worry. She was sitting on the couch, still in her work uniform, her eyes tired but alert. "What happened?" "I heard sirens. I've been worried sick." James sat down across from her, the events of the night spilling out in a rush. He told her about the bikers, the chase, and how Cole had saved him. As he spoke, his mom's expression shifted from fear to anger. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice trembling. "What were you thinking, taking them on like that?" "I didn't have a choice," James said quietly. "They were trying to hurt me." His mom sighed, burying her face in her hands. "You're just like your father," she muttered, "always running toward trouble instead of away from it." James frowned. What does Dad have to do with this? His mom froze, as if realizing she had said too much. "Nothing," she said quickly, standing up. "We'll talk about this in the morning." The next day, James couldn't shake the feeling that his mom knew more than she was letting on. Her mention of his dad had struck a nerve. His father had been a major influence in his life, teaching him everything he knew about self-defense before he passed away when James was 12. But there were gaps in his dad's story, years he never talked about. And now, with Cole's sudden appearance, those gaps felt more significant than ever. By 9:45 a.m., James was on his bike heading toward the Ironwood Diner. His mom had barely spoken to him that morning, her worry manifesting in a tense silence. As he pulled into the diner's parking lot, his stomach churned with anticipation. Cole was waiting, leaning against his truck with a cup of coffee in hand. He nodded as James approached. "Right on time," he said. James got off his bike, crossing his arms. "All right, I'm here. Start talking." Cole chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "You're direct. I like that." He set the cup down on the truck's hood. "Tell me, James, what do you know about your dad?" James frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "He was a soldier. He trained me. That's all there is to know." Cole's expression darkened, a shadow passing over his face. "Not quite," he said. "Your dad and we worked together. A long time ago." James blinked, caught off guard. "Worked together? Doing what?" Cole hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "Let's just say your dad wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something bigger. And if those bikers were after you, it's because of him." James felt the air leave his lungs. "What are you talking about? Why would they care about my dad?" Cole straightened up, his eyes scanning the parking lot as if he expected trouble. "Because," he said slowly, "your dad left something behind, something they want." Before James could respond, the sound of engines echoed in the distance. Cole's jaw tightened, and he reached for the crowbar in his truck. "They found us," Cole muttered. "Time to move." The low rumble of engines grew louder, shaking the ground beneath James' feet. He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. 3 bikes roared into the Ironwood Diner parking lot, their riders dressed in matching black vests adorned with the Black Vulture's insignia. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted and pointed a finger at Cole. "Thought you could hide from us, didn't you?" the man growled. His voice was sharp like broken glass. "You've got something we want." Cole didn't flinch. He grabbed the crowbar from his truck and stepped in front of James, shielding him. "You boys must really enjoy losing," Cole said, his tone calm but dangerous. "I'd have thought last night taught you something." The man with the scar smirked. "Oh, we learned all right. That's why we brought reinforcements." 2 more bikes pulled up, their riders dismounting quickly. James' stomach dropped as the odds stacked further against them. 5 bikers, all armed and ready for a fight, now circled the parking lot. James clenched his fists, his mind racing. "What do they want?" he asked Cole under his breath. Cole glanced at him, his expression grim. "They're not here for your bike, kid. They're here for what your dad left behind." James' brow furrowed. "You keep saying that. What did my dad leave?" Cole hesitated, his eyes darting toward the bikers. "Something that could ruin a lot of people if it got into the wrong hands. He didn't trust anyone else to keep it safe." James stared at him, his chest tightening. "Why didn't he tell me?" "He was trying to protect you," Cole said simply. "But now it's your problem." "Enough talking," the scarred man barked, pulling a chain from his belt. "Hand it over, or we'll take it from you." Cole gripped the crowbar tighter, stepping forward. "You can try." The first biker lunged, swinging a metal pipe at Cole's head. Cole dodged, countering with a sharp swing of the crowbar that sent the man stumbling back. James barely had time to process the movement before another biker came at him, brandishing a knife. James ducked, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until the knife fell to the ground. With a quick kick, he sent the biker reeling backward. The parking lot exploded into chaos. Engines revved, fists flew, and the sound of metal clashing against metal echoed through the air. James fought with every ounce of his training, dodging blows and landing quick, precise strikes. But the bikers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Cole was a whirlwind of motion, his crowbar a blur as he took on 2 bikers at once. Despite the odds, he moved with a precision that left James in awe. It wasn't just brute force, it was strategy. Cole anticipated every move, turning the bikers' aggression against them. "Behind you!" James shouted as another biker charged at Cole from the rear. Without turning, Cole swung the crowbar backward, catching the man in the stomach. The biker doubled over, groaning in pain. "Good call, kid," Cole said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Just as it seemed they might hold their ground, the sound of more engines filled the air. James' heart sank as a second wave of bikers arrived, At least 6 more, their headlights cutting through the morning haze. "This isn't good," James muttered, backing toward his bike. Cole didn't respond immediately. He was scanning the scene, his jaw tight. Finally, he said, "Get to your bike, James. We're getting out of here. There's too many of them." James protested. "Trust me," Cole said firmly. "I've got a plan." James didn't argue. He jumped on his bike and started the engine. Cole moved to the truck, reaching into the cab and pulling out a small black duffel bag. Slinging it over his shoulder, he climbed into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. "Stick close to me," Cole shouted over the roar of the bikes. "And don't stop for anything." The bikers closed in as James and Cole tore out of the parking lot, their vehicles kicking up gravel. The chase was on again, but this time, it was on a much larger scale. As they sped down the highway, James glanced at the duffel bag in Cole's truck. "What's in the bag?" he shouted. Cole's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where the bikers were gaining ground. "The reason they're after us," he said, "and the reason we can't let them catch us." James tightened his grip on the handlebars, his mind racing. What could possibly be in that bag that was worth risking their lives? Before he could ask, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them, a bullet whizzing past his head. The highway turned into a war zone as bullets zipped through the air, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing in James' ears. He swerved his bike sharply to avoid another shot, his tires skidding slightly on the asphalt. Ahead, Cole's truck barreled down the road, swerving between lanes as he kept an eye on the growing pack of bikers behind them. "Cole!" James shouted over the roar of the engines. "What's the plan?" Cole leaned out the driver's side window, his face grim. "We're heading to the old quarry. Tight turns, narrow paths. They'll have to split up." James felt a flicker of hope. He knew the quarry, a labyrinth of winding dirt trails and abandoned machinery. If they could get there, they might have a chance to outmaneuver the bikers. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Behind them, the bikers spread out, some firing at their tires while others tried to close the gap. The scarred leader was among them, his face twisted in fury. "You're not getting away," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the chaos. The road to the quarry was treacherous, sharp turns, steep inclines, and loose gravel everywhere. Cole's truck bounced and skidded as he led the way, but he didn't slow down. James stayed close behind, his smaller bike handling the rough terrain better than the heavier Harleys. As they neared the entrance to the quarry, Cole shouted, "James, take the left trail. I'll draw them to the right." "What?" James yelled, stunned. "You can't take them all on by yourself." "I'm not planning to." Cole shot back. "Just trust me, kid. Go." James hesitated, but another gunshot snapped him into action. He veered left, his bike kicking up dust as he sped down the narrower trail. Behind him, a few bikers split off to follow, their engines roaring like angry beasts. The quarry's paths twisted and turned, the high walls of rock creating blind corners and sudden drops. James pushed his bike to its limits, the roar of his pursuers growing louder with every second. He spotted a gap between two boulders and darted through it, hoping to lose them. It worked partially. Two of the bikers peeled off, unable to navigate the tight squeeze. But the scarred leader wasn't giving up. He followed James doggedly, his bike skidding dangerously close to the edge of a steep drop. James' heart pounded as he saw the trail narrow even further ahead. He couldn't outrun the leader, but maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart him. As James approached the edge of the trail, he spotted an old ramp, a rusted metal structure that jutted out over a small ravine. It looked unstable, but it was his only option. He gunned the engine, his bike hurtling toward the ramp. For a split second, he doubted his plan, but there was no turning back. The bike launched into the air, the ravine yawning below him. James landed hard on the other side, his tires skidding but holding steady. He turned just in time to see the scarred leader reach the ramp, his face a mask of determination. The metal groaned and snapped, sending the biker and his Harley plummeting into the ravine. James sat frozen, staring at the scene below as the dust settled. Meanwhile, Cole was facing the rest of the gang at the heart of the quarry. His truck had ground to a halt near an old crane, and he had taken up a defensive position behind the vehicle. The duffel bag sat on the ground next to him, its contents still a mystery. "Last chance," Cole shouted, gripping the crowbar tightly. "Turn around and walk away." The bikers laughed, their leader stepping forward. "You've got nowhere to go, old man. Hand over the bag, and maybe we'll let you crawl out of here." Cole smirked. "Crawl? Not my style." The bikers rushed him, but Cole was ready. He swung the crowbar with deadly precision, taking down 2 men in quick succession. He ducked and rolled, avoiding another blow as he used the terrain to his advantage. But he was outnumbered, and even Cole's skill had its limits. Just as one of the bikers raised a gun to fire at Cole, James roared back into the clearing. His bike skidded to a stop, and without thinking, he grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the gunman. The impact sent the man sprawling, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Miss me?" James called out, adrenaline surging through him. Cole grinned, nodding. "Perfect timing, kid." Together, they fought back, James using his agility to dart around the bikers while Cole handled the heavier blows. Slowly but surely, the tide turned. One by one, the bikers fell, until only Greg and another thug remained. Greg, battered and furious, stumbled toward the duffel bag. "If I can't have it, no one will," he shouted, pulling out a lighter. "No!" James yelled, realizing what he was about to do. Cole moved faster. He lunged at Greg, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. The blow knocked the lighter from Greg's hand and sent him sprawling to the ground. Cole stood over him, breathing hard. "This ends now." Greg glared up at him, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You have no idea what you're protecting," he spat. Cole didn't respond. He picked up the duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder. "James," he said, turning toward the teen. "Time to go." As they left the quarry, the bikers groaning behind them, James couldn't hold back his curiosity any longer. "What's in the bag, Cole? Why is it worth all this?" Cole glanced at him, his face serious. "It's not what's in the bag," he said. "It's what it leads to." James frowned. "Leads to what?" Cole didn't answer. Instead, he handed James a folded piece of paper. "Your dad left this for you. He wanted you to know the truth when the time was right." James unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he read the coordinates scrawled across it. "What is this?" Cole's expression was grim. "Your dad's final mission. And now it's ours."